Speaking on radiological findings in liquid appendicitis and role of the appendix is a blind-ending tubular structure arising from the cecum. The base arises from the posterior aspect of the cecum. The base of the appendix is fixed depending on the location of the cecum. However, the distal part is mobile. The appendix is around 8 to 10 centimeters in length, and it can occupy any region around the cecum. It can be retrocecal, can be retroileal, pre-ileal, or in the pelvis. Among these, the most common location being retrocecal. The inflammation of the appendix is acute appendicitis. It is most common abdominal surgical emergency. The cause is luminal obstruction. There are various causes for luminal obstruction. It can be lymphoid hyperplasia, infection, fecal stasis of E. coli being the most common cause, parasites, foreign bodies, and neoplasm. So the obstruction of the appendix leads to inflammation, and this inflammation at a very early stage may be seen as minimal inflammation of the distal appendix or the distal third of the appendix. As the infection progresses or the disease progresses, it may lead to suppurative gangrenous form perforation with other complications. Spontaneous resolution is also seen in acute appendicitis, and patient may present with recurrent appendicitis where there are more than one episodes of acute appendicitis, symptoms of appendicitis with spontaneous resolution in between. Clinically, there are various differential diagnoses for a patient presenting with pain abdomen in the right lower quadrant, starting from a renal calculi to ectopic pregnancy or ovarian torsion or omental torsion. Now, when a patient presents with typical findings of appendicitis where he has a McBurney point tenderness, rebound tenderness, and radiating type of pain, then the diagnosis is relatively certain. But there are atypical presentations due to the different location of the appendix, different location of the cecum. Sometimes the cecum may be subhepatic in location and the appendix being subhepatic in location, and the pain may not be in the right lower quadrant and rather be in the right upper quadrant. So imaging plays a role in diagnosing these patients who present with atypical presentation and patients presenting with acute appendicitis in extremes of age and pregnant women. So multi-detector CT and graded compression Doppler ultrasonography is a powerful imaging modality for substantial imaging modality and substantially improve the diagnostic accuracy in patients with clinically equivocal appendicitis. Before 1980s, the radiographs were primary imaging modality which were available for diagnosing patients with appendicitis. Now, with a patient with typical signs or clinical features and physical examination signs of appendicitis, on radiograph appendicolith is seen, this is diagnostic of an acute appendicitis, which is the most specific sign in a radiograph. The other signs which can be seen are a sentinel loop or a dilated bowel in the right iliac fossa, signs of small bowel obstruction, or obliteration of the psoas fat line or preperitoneal fat. Barium examination, again obsolete technique now due to advances in imaging modality, was used earlier as a diagnostic tool for acute appendicitis. This is an appearance of a normal appendix where the appendix is filled with contrast. So non-filling or incomplete filling of an appendix is diagnostic of a appendicitis on a barium study in a patient presenting with typical clinical and physical examination signs. Both these modalities are non-specific, and all patients with acute appendicitis may not show these signs, and they may be non-filling of the appendix even when the appendix is not inflamed or when it is normal. So with advance in technology, that is since 1986, when Poyletter, who described the graded compression technique of ultrasound, this has now become, and still the same technique is being used as the primary diagnostic modality for diagnosis of appendix. So in this technique, a linear high frequency transducer is used, and a graded compression is applied on the right lower quadrant. Now this graded compression is to displace the bowel loops and fat, and to compress the appendix between the abdominal walls. Now a non-compressible appendix is an inflamed, thickened and non-compressible appendix is an inflamed appendix. Now advantages of ultrasound is there is no radiation exposure, it's non-invasive, widely available and inexpensive, and compared to the radiographs, they other potential diagnosis for abdominal pain or right lower quadrant pain can be diagnosed, like ovarian torsion or ectopic pregnancy rupture or ureteric or UV junction calculus. Several authors have suggested ultrasound as the first imaging method in pregnant women and pediatric patients because radiation exposure is especially undesirable in these groups. The disadvantages operator dependent, because there is a very long learning curve in a patient, in a person getting the expertise in picking up an inflamed appendix in a patient presenting with appendicitis. Intestinal peristalsis or pulsation of the iliac artery when the appendix is close to them may also provide difficulty or make it difficult for picking up an inflamed appendix. And a patient with severe pain or incooperative patient, a graded compression cannot be applied, where the diagnosis may not be, where the imaging modality may not be of much help. Now there are several studies which have showed that the ultrasound in an experienced hand have a sensitivity of up to 75 to 90%, specificity of around 86 to 100%, and accuracy of around 87 to 96%. So the healthy appendix is not visualized usually on ultrasound examination. So this is an ultrasound image of an healthy appendix. We see a blind ending tubular structure in the right lower quadrant, which is compressible on compression, and the thickness of it is less than 6 millimeter. So 6 millimeter thickened appendix is one which is more than 6 millimeter and which is non-compressible. So this is an image of an inflamed appendix. We see a thickened appendix which is non-compressible here, and there is color flow which is seen. So a non-compressible blind ending tubular structure which is aperistylitic in a right lower quadrant measuring more than 6 millimeter is the imaging sign, or this suggests acute appendicitis. The signs of other signs of appendicitis, other associated signs like fluid in the right lower quadrant or presence of an appendicolith can also be demonstrated on ultrasound. The thinning of the appendiceal wall with air or reverberation artifact, which when seen in this area will suggest that the appendix is going for gangrenous transformation or perforated. However, a perforated appendix with air within the inflamed appendix will be very difficult to image with an ultrasound because of reverberation artifact from the air. Now, CT is highly accurate and effective for diagnosing and staging appendicitis. This is especially preferred when appendiceal perforation is suspected. Now, studies have shown that CT in patients with abdominal pain have decreased the negative laparotomy rate and appendiceal perforation rate. The technique what is used is a thin section CT of the abdomen and pelvis, oral and intravenous contrast. Now, oral contrast is essential because usually in children the intra-abdominal fat is they have very less intra-abdominal fat. So when you don't give oral contrast, it becomes very difficult to pick up an inflamed appendix and differentiate it from a adjacent ileal loop or fluid-filled ileal loop. And intravenous contrast will help us picking early appendicitis where it shows mucosal enhancement in an inflamed appendix. A study done by Moulin et al. Have shown that with introduction of oral and intravenous contrast, the sensitivity of picking up appendicitis was increased from 87% to 96 to 98%. The advantages are the appendix can be directly visualized. The periappendiceal region can be evaluated for adjacent inflammation or inflammatory changes. It can help us to stage the severity of the appendix and the extent of involvement, presence of perforation, abscess or peritonitis. It can reveal other alternative diagnosis like whether there is inflammation of the adjacent structure, or whether there are other causes for abdominal pain like a ureteric calculus or a renal calculus or a omental infarct or a epiploic appendicitis. So in a patient with plain abdomen, the CT has a very high sensitivity and accuracy, and it is non-invasive. The disadvantage is radiation exposure, anaphylactoid reaction when intravenous contrast may have to be given, and the procedure is lengthy when oral contrast has to be given, because a patient has to wait for around 45 to 1 hour after the injection of the contrast for it to reach up till the proximal colon. And rectal contrast is discomfort to patient. Now these are the studies which show that appendix, so picking up appendicitis on a CT has very high sensitivity up to 100% and accuracy up to 98%. So among the imaging modalities, this CT is the most sensitive and most accurate imaging modality in picking up appendicitis, staging it and picking up its complication and the extent of involvement. So this is an image, these are two images of two different patients showing the normal appendix. This is a normal appendix which is less than 6 millimeters in thickness. The fat around the appendix is neat. It is not inflamed or there is no stranding in the fat. And on contrast administration, there is filling of contrast, on injection of oral contrast, is filling of oral contrast within the appendix. So this is the appearance of a normal appendix. Now the imaging, CT imaging features of an inflamed appendix is thickened appendix measuring more than 6 millimeter, wall enhancement, lack of filling up of the appendix with ingested oral contrast, surrounding fat stranding, and appendicular. So these are few images, few illustrations of appendicitis with varying degree of severity. Now here what we see is this is an inflamed appendix. It is fluid filled. It is showing a subtle fat stranding, and this is subhepatic in location. This is an early appendicitis, or it is an early stage of inflammation. Here again we see a inflamed appendix. This is an inflamed thickened appendix with adjacent fat stranding, fluid. There is thickening of the adjacent retroperitoneal fascia. This is of a little higher severity than the case which we saw earlier. This is the third case with a complication. Here we see a large peripheral enhancing collection which is seen in the pelvis. We see an appendicular, and this is the inflamed thickened appendix. This is the cecum, and this is the inflamed thickened appendix. So this is an inflamed appendix, acute appendicitis with perforation and abscess. So this is a case with complication. Now this is a case, this is an image which I have shown to illustrate the point that why oral contrast is very much essential. So this is a patient who presented with acute abdomen. Now here we see an ill-defined density, but we are not sure whether it's an inflamed appendix or whether it is non-ossified bowel loop. We asked for an repeat scan with oral contrast. The same patient. Now here we see this density which is not ossified with contrast. This is a tubular thickened appendix which is not ossified with contrast, and rest of the bowel loops have ossified with contrast. So this emphasizes that in a pediatric patient, oral contrast is essential because we will not be able to differentiate an inflamed appendix from an adjacent fluid-filled ileal loop. This is a second case again. This is a non-contrast scan which was
Would it be the same case in the adult patient with the early appendicitis, or oral contrast may not be required, or would they require in early cases of in an adult patient?
Paucity of intra-abdominal fat is more in children.
Okay.
Now in an adult case, generally there will be good amount of intra-abdominal fat. Not every patient. If it's a very lean and thin patient, again there will be less of intra-abdominal fat. The ideal technique is to give oral and intravenous contrast. Now there are exceptions. I mean, if a patient comes in an emergency, he is not prepared. You don't have his urea creatinine levels. He is having excessive vomiting. The scan can still be done, and in an adult, it is relatively easier to pick up an appendix than in an infant, than in a pediatric population.
With you can pick it up in a plain study also.
We can. But if the patient is very lean and thin and there's positive...
No, if the clinical suspicion is there, about 60% if the clinical suspicion is there in an adult, so we can go for directly for a plain CT, and if it correlates with the lab findings and the clinical findings, I think we should do it without the contrast, without the oral contrast. It should be, we should be able to get it right, because it would be very quick.
See, as I told you, ideal is with oral and intravenous contrast. Now, if there is no, if the patient can consume he is not having nausea and vomiting, and if his lab values of urea and creatinine are available, it is ideal to do a study with oral and intravenous contrast. Because what if we are not able to pick up an inflamed appendix due to some limitation? Then we are ordering a second CT scan with oral and intravenous contrast, which will again increase the radiation dose. If it is not possible at all, I mean it's an acute emergency where the patient is very toxic, then a non-contrast study can be done. I mean, it's relatively easier to pick up an inflamed appendix in an adult as compared to a pediatric population.
My point is just to make investigative process a little lesser. If we are suspecting, then we can get it with a plain scan, and if it correlates, then patient may not be subjected for oral and IV contrast. That's what I want to emphasize.
You can diagnose it without contrast.
If it is a clinical suspicion is there, if the...
What is your pickup rate when you do it without contrast as compared to when you do it with contrast? How many times would we miss out if we do it without
The pickup rate is always better when a study is done with oral and intravenous contrast.
No, always better, yes.
But the patient, we can't subject all the patient to oral and intravenous contrast. That would be a bit. And if it's negative...
if I go back to my old slide, see, this is a study which shows that the pickup rate, I mean the sensitivity has increased from 87% to 96-98% after the administration of oral and intravenous contrast. So there is a difference. I mean, if it is not possible, then a non-contrast study also can be done and appendix can be picked up. But it's difficult when it is a pediatric patient. Now, as I showed you this case.
For pediatric patient, we could always ask for an oral contrast, but for adults, to have a quick diagnosis, because 1 hour we have to wait, and if clinical suspicion is there.
I think ultrasound then.
Okay.
Yes.
If you
ultrasound also will take
time. If ultrasound picks up a finding, and it correlates clinically, then the diagnosis is done.
See, most of the pediatric patients pretty much don't end up getting CTs. In those which the ultrasound is kind of iffy and your clinical suspicion is weak, those are the only ones who go for CT.
The first imaging modality should always be ultrasound, because there is no radiation and it is easily available. It doesn't take a long time. I mean, there is no 1 hour waiting time for the contrast to reach the colon. So, if you have a very strong clinical suspicion, first get an ultrasound done. It is not picked by an ultrasound, it is equivocal. In ultrasound, they cannot pick up, like the limitation. The retrocecal appendix may not always be picked up on ultrasound. Then the patient should be taken for a CT.
Okay.
So the question is, if it's an adult as opposed to a child, then the issue is whether you can just straight away do non-contrast CT. Siddharth, in the US, we report a lot of scans for emergency rooms in the US, and let me tell you that every patient who comes into the emergency room with abdominal pain is getting a non-contrast CT, because they don't want to wait to give the patient contrast. It delays the triage, and so we end up seeing a lot of patients who have non-contrast CTs, they have in pelvis, and we are able to diagnose appendicitis on them. So,
and also lab findings.
The only issue is if the patient is extremely thin, then it can be a problem, which is what Dr. Savitz is referring to. I think less than 10% where the sensitivity is increased by giving oral and IV contrast. So yeah, if the patient looks reasonably well built and robust to you, then by all means go ahead and order it without contrast. But if it's a really skinny patient, then we would suggest getting it with oral and IV in the first place, because then that will avoid having to rescan.
Okay, thank you. And when the lab findings are there, like the counts are very high, so it should correlate with there's nothing else, maybe in a female patient, or if it's a female patient, it could be a pelvic inflammatory disease or something. But it's a male patient, and without the, I mean, to how to means as a GP, what I want to know is how quickly and easily we can get to the diagnosis. Theoretically, do this thing oral and IV contrast would definitely help, but in practical we have to think very sure that we have to.
If it's a pediatric patient and you have a typical presentation of appendicitis clinically and on physical examination, take the patient for an ultrasound. Ultrasound picks up the finding, the investigation ends there. The ultrasound doesn't pick up the finding, the patient will go for a CT with oral intravenous contrast. Okay. If it is a female patient, again take the patient for an ultrasound first. Like the differentials are many. You can have an torsion, which can be
torsion. There might not be fever with torsion. Like clinically, if we have a differential of ureteric colic, then I would never ask for a oral contrast. So if they don't have a fever and there is no question of being an appendix, so if there's no fever, so it's, and if he has a radiating pain, so it's almost likely that it is a ureteric
You do get
pain.
a lot of appendixes without fever.
Okay. No, but the pain may not be radiating, and as far as I think,
I don't know, but among women patients, it is
It's more of a clinical judgment. Like first it's not
always
clinical.
No,
it is
the-
difficult to make out between a torsion.
thing is how to reach a quick diagnosis with minimal thing. So CT scan is bit
No, but
quicker.
he already said, no. He said that
Start with ultrasound.
start an ultrasound. If you have a doubt, do a non-contrast CT.
If you're still not
If
able
you're
to
still
make
having a doubt,
ultrasound,
use a
then
non-oral
proceed.
plus this thing. That's all.
Okay.
I think you can carry on.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, this case illustrates that oral contrast is essential in pediatric population. Here, this was a inflamed appendix. I mean, not very sure because of the non-opacified bowel loops. Now it is not opacified with contrast, confirming that it's an appendicitis. This is another case. This is an inflamed bowel which is seen. Initially, when it was reported, it was not. They were not sure whether it is an inflamed appendix or an inflamed terminal ileum. They asked for an study with contrast and both oral and intravenous contrast. This is the follow-up. You see, it is enhancing well. Wall is enhancing and it is not filled with oral contrast. Though this oral contrast is not reached till the ileum, it is enhancing well, and it's pretty clear that this is an inflamed appendix. The best imaging modality now is CT because of its accuracy and sensitivity and specificity. But in a pregnant patient, after an ultrasound, an alternate imaging modality is MRI. There are studies which have showed that MR is far superior than ultrasound in evaluation of pregnant patients suspected appendicitis. But there are a lot of limitations with MRI. It is cost. It is very costly. It is not available everywhere. It takes the scan time takes longer. Patient may be claustrophobic, may not stay for long in the gantry. So, but in a pregnant patient, if the ultrasound is equivocal for an appendicitis, and if there is a high clinical suspicion, the next imaging modality will be MRI. So here I conclude by saying that in acute appendicitis, ultrasound has always been and is the primary imaging modality. When the findings on ultrasound is equivocal, then the patient next imaging modality is CT, except for in a pregnant patient where MRI is the next imaging modality. Thank you.
Questions?
Any questions?
What are the unusual presentations of appendicitis that you've seen on CT?
On CT. One is the location. Now we see an inflamed appendix which is in the subhepatic region or which is very low in the pelvis. Second is with complications. There are appendix with a large perforated abscess, appendix with generally they don't produce a lot of pneumoperitoneum. Right? It will always form a contained perforation. Then we have seen appendix within the hernia sac, in the ventral abdominal hernia, in the inguinal hernia, with an inflamed appendix within these hernia sacs. So and malrotated bowel with appendix, inflamed appendix on the opposite side.
And Meckel's diverticulum can be picked up on a CT scan?
Yeah, Meckel's diverticulum can be picked up on a CT scan.
One of the differentials.
Because the inflamed outpouching which will be seen in the distal ileum far away from the appendix. But as it is also a differential for an appendix.
Thank you.
Can you pick up a retrocecal appendix on ultrasound?
Yeah. The technique for the pickup rate is less, but the technique for doing an ultrasound in a retrocecal appendix is the probe is placed laterally to see the cecum. To see the part of the abdomen behind the cecum and pick up the inflamed appendix. Sometimes other technique is you put a compression from behind and try to push up the bowel loops. So these are the two techniques which is used to look for a retrocecal appendix. But it is a little difficult because with the inflamed appendix, the cecum may be dilated and it may be gas filled or fluid filled, which makes the picking up of appendix difficult.
How difficult is to pick up an appendix in a normal ultrasound? Because is it very difficult or is it moderately difficult or it's easy?
It's a thin patient and appendix is pre-ileal. It is very easy. You put a probe and you pick up, see an inflamed. I'm saying about an inflamed appendix, not a normal appendix. Inflamed appendix. If the patient is very obese and it is a very retrocecal appendix, then the pickup rate will be close to 0. So it depends on the location of the appendix, whether the patient is well built, whether the patient is lean, and the pickup rate in a pediatric population is better on an ultrasound. Any more questions? Thank you.
The vaccine and cancer cervix. To start off, why are we talking so much about cancer cervix? We all have learned it in our MBBS days, cancer cervix, to clear our exams. But why is it important for us? The incidence of cancer cervix in our country is every day 200 women are dying of cancer cervix. To brief it up, every 7 minutes a woman is being diagnosed positive for cancer cervix in our country. So common is the disease in our country. We contribute about 16% of the world's population, but when it comes to contributing to CS cervix, 25% is our contribution towards CS cervix in the incidence, and 27% is the contribution towards mortality for CS cervix from our country. So definitely we are a huge contributor to CS cervix world over, and in our country also the incidence is very high. World over data says that cancer cervix is the commonest cancer among women, and like we said previously, we contribute a huge number of it to the world. That is why we need to be talking about cancer cervix. The incidence of cancer cervix, it's not just the death that comes from cancer cervix, the mortality, morbidity, everything that comes from it is equally important. The data says that every year, for every 1 lakh women that's being diagnosed to be cancer cervix, 16 will die by the age of 30, between that age span of 30 to 70 years. That is, the death because of cancer cervix is 0.7%. We are all talking about maternal mortality. It's not that maternal mortality is not important, but the mortality rate when we are talking about deaths due to pregnancy is 0.6%, whereas from cancer cervix is 0.7%. Still a neglected field, still needs to be looked into, though the incidence is so high. Now, what is it that when we have cancer cervix, don't we have treatment? Definitely we have treatment for cancer cervix, but the treatment will all depend upon what stage of the disease are we in, what is the size of the tumor, what is the woman's age, and what is her desire to have children. In the early stages of the disease, the treatment is partial surgery, or early stages of the disease, it's a conservative surgery where a part of the cervix can be removed, that is the leaf procedure or the LEDS procedure, or sometimes an electrocoagulation or a cryocoagulation. Even this comes with its own morbidity later on. Though having done this procedure, we have saved the uterus, we have saved the ovaries, but for this woman to get pregnant is not going to be easy. For this woman to then carry on the pregnancy till term is again not going to be easy. So even if it is in the very early stages, which would get picked up in the younger age group, still we would have problems when we have treated the cancer cervix. In the later stages, when I talk about later stages, stage 1, that is the earliest stage kind of, even then the treatment is surgery or birth-time cystectomy, where the whole uterus, tubes, ovaries, parametrium, all the lymph nodes have to be removed. It is extensive surgery when it is stage 1 of the disease, may or may not be followed by radiotherapy depending upon the lymph node positivity. When we are talking about the later stages of the disease, that is stage 1B and beyond, or stage 2 and beyond, the treatment is mainly radiotherapy, because even extensive surgery will not help to clear up the disease. And as we all are aware of it, radiotherapy definitely comes with lots of complications. Morbidity is very high after radiotherapy. Leading a normal life after radiotherapy is tough, especially when it is for cancer cervix, because there is a lot of damage that comes to the ureters, to the bladder. Like we all, I think like me, all of us had mugged up point A and point B to clear our entrance exams. Only afterwards I understood why we had to mug it up, because that are the most sensitive points where the damages happen when radiotherapy is given for cancer, cancer cervix, which is where the ureters enter and where the ovaries would come. That was the significance of point A and point B that we mugged up to clear our exams. So now, when we know this is the incidence, this is the significance, this is the mortality and morbidity from cancer cervix, how can we protect ourselves from this condition? First, definitely is the awareness of the disease, which kind of is now coming, but still not too much of an awareness is there. Second, this is going by our SPM classes, awareness, vaccination, early prevention, that kind of a thing. And third is the screening. Now, let me talk first about screening, then we will come to the vaccine part of it. Like we are all aware of it, pap smear is the commonest used tool for screening for cancer cervix. The whole problem with pap smear is it picks up only 60% of the disease. 40% false negativity is there with pap smear. Then came the modality of doing an HPV testing, which gave an incidence of pickup of 70%, but expensive procedure. Combination of pap smear and HPV is the latest what they are saying, every woman to be screened for HPV. If the woman is turning out to be positive for HPV, then go ahead and keep doing 6 months pap smears. So your pickup rate of the disease will be 95%. But an HPV screening is expensive, not easy, not painful procedure, but an expensive procedure. So cannot be probably used as an extensive screening modality, because it is difficult, it is an expensive thing. So if we have to screen so many women, the cost is a major issue when it comes to screening with HPV. So we are going the other way. We do a pap smear, suspicious on pap smear, do a HPV. Suspicious on HPV, you get the HPV diagnosis, then okay, you say further go ahead. Many times we even skip off the HPV thing, saying doesn't matter, pap smear is suggestive of HPV positive, go with it, that pap smear is suggestive of HPV positive. Keep screening regularly these patients, screen them more frequently.
Is it a test HPV? What is it? Screening? Is it a...
Yeah, it is a swab test where, like a pap smear, you just put a brush into the endocervix and the ectocervix. So you get the cells from there. It comes with its own media. So you just put the brush into the media. So you have cultured the cells, the HPV virus there. So they then, not cultured exactly, they do something like the FISH technique, the fluorescent techniques to then pick it up. So it is on the expensive side. Like about 5 years back when HPV was being done in St. John's, each test used to cost almost 3,000 rupees. And they take long to report it, because even in a place like Bangalore, there are very few centers which are doing the HPV testing. Most of it goes to Delhi. There's this Dr. Lal's labs and all that where they're doing it. So it goes in bulk, comes back in bulk. So the reporting time we tell patients is generally 2 weeks. Now many of the centers have come up with doing HPV testing in our thing, like Manipal is doing it now, but again on request. And that's why most of the clinics or the gynec clinics don't have the HPV swab test available with them easily. So unless you have that, I see a cervix, I feel maybe this is definitely positive, or I do a pap smear and I feel, or the history of the patient is suggestive for HPV. So then by the time I tell the patient you may be HPV positive, come back tomorrow because I'll get the kit and then do it, the patient has done the Google search on HPV and never comes. That is what happens. Now the pap smear test, as we are all aware, it is a simple test, does not require too much of time, can be done at any time of the month other than during the periods, just requires 2 minutes to go to see the doctor, gynecologist, midwife, nurse, anybody can do the pap smear test. Just taking a swab, not a painful test, that is what I want to insist and say. Most of the doctors scare their patients, most of the patients come in with this impression, pap smear test is a painful test, the doctor will cut and take off some part from your body. I don't know from where this has come, but almost every woman who comes in for the pap smear asks me, doctor, are you going to cut and take off something from there? And then you'll end up explaining, no, it is not cut and take off, it is like I touch, I get a few cells. So pap smear is just touch and you get a few cells, that is what is pap smear. Just taking those cells. Now there are various ways of doing the pap smear, these are the newer ones. We are still following the conventional slide method, where we just take the cells on the swab, spread it on the slide, spray it with a fixative, send it to the lab, stain, 2 days later we get the report. That's a conventional pap smear method. In this, the problem is the person who takes it, if they don't spread it properly, there's a lot of infection, we're not able to clear off the infected cells. So of the number of cells we study, we get very few representative cells to study. So came the newer technique, which is the liquid-based cytology, where instead of, when you're taken the swab, instead of spreading it on the slide, it's just dropped into the liquid. So then by the natural process of centrifuging, the cells get separated off. Then these cells are separated and spread on the slide. So because then this is prepared in the lab, you get a mono layer slide. So you get a better representation of the slides and you're able to see them better. So this is the newer thing, but again expensive. They are in Bangalore, but again expensive. That is what is the concern with this. And because there was a lot of errors in reporting on the pap smear. The same slides being read by different doctors, some would say normal, some would say inflammatory, some would say CIN1, or would say there is probably doubtful, lot of infection. So then came the computer assisted screening pap smears, where so many cells studied, put into the data, the computer reads the slide basically, but then it also comes with its own problems in the sense that the slides have to be, it will reject the slide if the slide is, the spread of the slide is not proper. It will just plain reject the slide, you don't have a report at all. Those are the kind of issues that come up when it comes to computer assisted Now the reporting of a pap smear, again, this is one issue where I've been landing up with always fighting, in the sense that we find, I'm sorry to use these words here, but lots of times our health checkup patients, unfortunately the data that goes to the pathologist is very incomplete for them to be able to report a pap smear. And nobody seems to be bothered about it. A pap smear cannot be reported unless the pathologist has all these data. To have a good reporting on a pap smear, we have to enter all this data. The menstrual cycles of the patient, which phase of the cycle is the patient in, whether the patient is on any hormonal therapy, is she having a Mirena in situ, is she on an HRT, is she on oral contraceptive pills, what was the indication to do the pap smear, was it a routine pap smear, is this a patient with a high risk suggested history in the form of a postcoital bleeding or intermenstrual bleeding, what was the look of the cervix. Many times when we do the pap smear, as we touch the cervix, it bleeds. Now seeing blood there, it is difficult to interpret and say whether it is because it was an erosion on the cervix, that is why the bleeding was there. Patient was a fag end of the period, so the bleeding was there. There was a polyp which you touched and it started bleeding, so that doctor reports lots of blood cells present in the smear. So unless and until that data is given to the pathologist, it is difficult for the pathologist to report it. Again, pregnancy, it needs to be reported. Why is this important? Is in our country, okay, we are not doing pap smears in the pregnancy, but everywhere else, when the person goes in for the first antenatal checkup, at least that is the opportunity used to do a pap smear. So that we have at least one time a pap smear screening done on a woman when she sees a gynecologist. So again, whether the woman is pregnant or not, because the ratio of the cells changes when the woman is pregnant, so the significance of the pap smear changes accordingly. Similarly, if the patient has had a previously abnormal reported pap smear, you have a previously abnormal reported pap smear, you're supposed to repeat your pap smears more frequently. Initially, WHO said once in a year is what is sufficient for normal pap smears. Abnormal pap smears once in 6 months, depending upon what is the abnormality you have found. Now you have found an abnormality this time, you don't report it to the pathologist. 6 months later you repeat it, same abnormality. 6 months later you repeat it, same abnormality, but the pathologist doesn't know. You don't know, you have not interpreted your reports correctly. If the abnormality is persisting, it needs to be treated. You cannot keep on ignoring it, saying it's okay, it's just marginal, it's marginal. If that is persisting, that is what we mean to say is an abnormal smear, early beginning of changes because of the HPV infection. If it is persisting, it needs to be treated. It cannot be left saying doesn't matter. So unless all this is reported, given to the pathologist cannot interpret back the report. And unless all this is there on the report, a gynecologist is not supposed to say whether the pap smear is normal or not normal, because it becomes difficult to make the interpretation. That is why all the errors come on reporting of a pap smear. Now the various terminologies that need to be standardized and used when we are reporting a pap smear. An unsatisfactory pap smear where the pathologist is not able to comment on the pap smear because of presence of too many abnormals, too many infected cells, or not a properly prepared slide, thick slide, or the slide cells have dried up before the slide could reach the labs. So then it is an unsatisfactory pap smear, or you have not got enough sample to say there are endocervical cells, there are cells from the transformation zone. You cannot report it correctly. That would be reported as an unsatisfactory pap smear, which means there's nothing wrong with the patient. It just means the pap smear needs to be repeated properly again, that's all. If it is a negative pap smear, means it is a normal pap smear. The ratio of the cells correspond to what it should be for that age group of patient. There is no abnormality found in that pap smear. No infection, no cancer, no precancerous cells found. That is a negative pap smear. A squamous abnormality is what we typically see as an inflammatory smear, most often being reported as an inflammatory smear, which is again a condition which need not be treated unless the history is suggestive of an acute infection. An inflammatory smear can be there lifelong without worrying about it. It need not be treated every time you see an inflammatory smear. Then comes the squamous intraepithelial lesions, which possibly low-grade squamous intraepithelial lesions, low-grade squamous intraepithelial lesions, possibly high-grade squamous intraepithelial. That is the old category of CIN1, CIN2. That is, precancerous changes are in carcinoma in situ has just started setting in. That means those are the conditions where we don't need to go for extensive surgery. Doing a procedure like, these are the patients where colposcopic directed procedures would be the thing then. You have found this on the pap smear, advise a patient for a colposcopy, see the extent of the disease, and decide if you can go in for a cone removal, a leaf procedure, or legs procedure, where only the affected part of the cervix, the 2 centimeters around that, is removed so that the disease is completely cleared off. The next is HSIL, that is high-grade squamous intraepithelial lesion, which is CIN3, where then the treatment is you go towards wartime cystectomy. And the glandular abnormalities also need to be reported on the pap smear, and the last is the cancer. So these are the headings how a pap smear should be reported. The final diagnosis on the interpretation of the pap smear should be either unsatisfactory, negative, squamous abnormalities, or the inflammatory smear, SIL, which grade, glandular abnormalities, and cancer. The other all terminologies would not be considered as standard terminologies. The pap smears to be reread by somebody would not be easy, would not be authenticated. Now, having said all this, we are talking about screening, doing a pap smear, doing so many things. What is the incidence, or how many people are actually finally going through the screening test? The study was done for 5 years, 3 years rather, and it was found that in the age group of 18 to 29, only 4% of the women go through screening, and that 4% is also probably because when the woman comes for a pregnancy, when the woman comes for infertility, postnatal checkup, when they come back, probably they are able to catch them and say and get a pap smear done. But as age increased 30 to 39, the incidence of screening dropped down to 3%. Overall, the incidence was only 2.6% of the women were going through a pap smear screening in our country. So are we going to really help by saying pap smear, pap smear, pap smear? This is the incidence of women going through a pap smear.
How many women in this room have had their pap smear in the last year? One.
Two. Only the US return ones. Frankly speaking, only the US return ones. None others. Two. So that is the thing. So that is the reason why probably Pap smear alone is not going to help us to take care of the disease and help us to eradicate the disease or decrease the morbidity and mortality from the disease. So therefore came the vaccine. Now how vaccine? So we have to know a cause if we have to prevent it. So what is the cause for a cervical cancer? It is the human papilloma virus, which is a DNA virus. More than 300 subtypes of this virus have been diagnosed to be causing lots of diseases, of which it is 16 and 18 which are responsible for cervical cancer. To make it easy to remember the strains which cause cervical cancer, say suppose when you're sending the HPV testing, so what strain are you going to look for? It is 16 and 18. Just to remember for MCQs is what I marked it up that time. 16 when you start getting sexually active, 18 when you're officially allowed to get sexually active. So you will get That's pretty good. So this is the reason for getting an HPV infection, the cervical cancer. 16 and 18 contribute. This data says 75%, but now the data says almost 90% of the cervical cancers are because of HPV 16 and 18. The same group, 16 and 18, is responsible for more than 50% of the vaginal and vulval cancers. Among the other commonly studied HPV subtypes are 6 and 11, which are responsible for 90% of the anogenital warts, which is the commoner problem with which adolescents present to doctors. They are more worried about the warts than anything else. Now, what is it is all of us are at a risk for developing HPV infection. The studies say that in the reproductive lifespan, almost 80% of the women will get some exposure to HPV infection or whatever it be. How much ever you may say, whatever you may say, the incidence of exposure to HPV infection is 80%. But our body has an immunity that most of these infections, more than 60 to 70% of these infections, will disappear off from the body without leaving back any long-lasting effect. It is only the remaining 40% which will go on to lead to causing low-grade abnormalities and cause problems. This was one of the statements made by one of the gynecologists in one of the international conferences saying HPV can probably be called a common cold of sexually active. So common is the incidence, so easily clearing off is the condition, yet so much bothersome is the condition. What does this cause? What does HPV cause? Does it cause only cervical cancer? In addition to causing cervical cancer, it does cause vulval cancers. 40% of the vulval cancers are because of HPV infection. Almost 90% of the vaginal cancers are because of HPV infection. 80% of the anal cancers, it has been proven because of HPV infection. Coming to men, cancers of the penis, 45% causes because of HPV. Oropharyngeal cancers because of HPV, though it's a different strain, it's not a 16 and 18 there. But HPV is the one which is responsible for it. Genital warts, 100% have been proven to be. Why I put all of this is the vaccine that we are talking, though it is for 16 and 18, it gives cross immunity, it gives cross protection for those which cause all these conditions also. So the vaccine will not be helpful only for cervical cancers. It will be helpful to protect all these conditions also because of the cross immunity that comes in from this. Now, when we talked so much about yes, role of vaccine and everything, so came the recommendation from WHO which said that yes, vaccine should be given, should be effective, useful, to be given for women between 9 to 10 years through 13 years of age before even the first exposure for HPV infection happens. But is it fair enough to restrict it only till that age group? No. The incidence of exposure to HPV when studied over 5 years of age. When a woman was studied from the age group of 15 to 20 years, the cumulative risk of her developing an HPV infection was 40%. Whereas when she touched the age group of about 40 years, the risk was still around 25%, the cumulative risk. So it is not that as after 15-19, you don't need to take the vaccine because you still are at a risk of developing the HPV infection. Though the incidence comes down with each year of life, by the time you touch 45, your cumulative risk to develop an HPV infection is only 10%, but still that risk is there. You cannot say that you are away from the risk. It is in the younger age group that the risk is more, probably because of the sexual practices that are being followed, but definitely the risk is there in the younger age group. Now when we have finished talking, yes, there is a need for the vaccine. Before we go ahead and say about the vaccine and who should be given, how safe is it to give this vaccine? Is it really safe to give the vaccine? WHO study says yes, safe to go ahead and give the vaccine. lot of studies being done. This vaccine has been there in the market for almost 9 years now, being used in various countries. In the USA, 40 million doses of the quadrivalent vaccine have been administered, of which only 20,000 of them reported back with some form of adverse reactions, as simple as a rash developing in the area, small abscess, pain, mild fever. 92% of these adverse effects were non-serious adverse effects. Only 8% of them presented back with serious adverse effects. Definitely not a contributor to Guillain-Barré syndrome or epilepsies or death. This is very important because about 4 years back, 5 years back in our country, when a study was done, there were 4 women reported to be found dead after taking the HPV vaccine. And there was a lot of halakha about it in the media, and the writing of the vaccine was banned, and it was said don't give the vaccine, it is not safe and all that. But later on, when the studies were followed up, it was found that 2 of these women actually committed suicide. One of them was already diagnosed to have a psychiatric problem and had nothing to do with the HPV vaccine. One died of any other complication, something like a pneumonia or something. So all the 4 deaths were proven to be not because of the HPV vaccine. But that data never came out big in the media. So that fear of taking the vaccine still persisted because the media created a big thing about the vaccine not being safe, but never got back to say yes, it is safe kind of thing when it was proven to be safe. So that is the important thing, that HPV vaccine is not unsafe. The risk of anaphylaxis of taking the vaccine that was found in this study was, of the 1.7 million doses that were given, only 1% developed anaphylaxis. Similar studies in Australia, there in fact the anaphylaxis data that they are saying is much more lesser, only 1 in 2.6 million. And this is the similar data coming up from almost every studies that have been followed up for the last 8-9 years. Before the vaccine companies asked for the licenses, they had put forward some safety criteria, 1, 2, 3, 4, our vaccine is so safe. After it is being used, those criteria are being met. It is not just for the sake of marketing the vaccine or bringing the vaccine into the market. It is being met. There is no changes in the pre-licenses and post-licenses safety of the vaccines. So definitely there is a need for the vaccine. The vaccine is going to have significant protection beyond the recommended age group, that is the 9 to 13. I will still continue to write the vaccine and not leave it to Dr. Sonal alone to write the vaccine. The vaccine is going to help in the later age group also. The vaccine targets diseases beyond cervical cancer. That is, it is useful for the whole range of diseases that we talked about. There is effectiveness. The vaccine is proven to be effective. In the 9-year studies, not really any failure of the vaccine has been documented. That is, when I say failure, one proven to be HPV negative before taking the vaccine given, followed up for the next 8-9 years, nobody turned out to be HPV positive in those women. So there is no failure documented from the vaccine. The vaccine confirms a long-term protection. There is no data saying that there would be need for giving boosters at the end of 5 years. Though the titers do fall down at the end of 5 years, but the titers are still being maintained in sufficient levels to give us protection. You don't have to have titer levels at 90 to be protected. Even those titer levels of 40, 50 are enough to be protected, and that is what is being maintained. So there is no need for boosters as on studies right now. And definitely the vaccine is safe. So there is no doubt that there is a role of the vaccine. Now to say the vaccine, basically 2 types of vaccines are available in our country or world over right now. One is the quadrivalent vaccine, where we have 16, 18, 6 and 11. That is where we have the 2 viruses responsible for the cancer and the 2 viruses responsible for the warts. This vaccine, the dosage schedule is you take the 0 dose or the first dose today, 2 months later is the second dose, 6 months later is the third dose. The other vaccine is where they have only 16 and 18, no protection for the warts. Whatever protection is for the warts is from the minimal cross protection that we are getting, which is not much for the warts. It is mainly for 33, 35, which are responsible for the other cancers that it is giving protection. So when it comes to cervical cancer, 16, 18 is what we need, but when we are giving it, if we can have additional protection from other things, 6 and 11, that will also help us. Now, the vaccine, it is not a live attenuated vaccine.
What is the incubation period, or what is the time duration when the virus infection to the wart formation or the cancer formation? Is it a very dormant virus, or is it
once you have the HPV positive to becoming cancer, it is almost 10 years is the time frame. And that is where the pap smears, where we were saying you should do your pap smears every year. Because you pick up HPV positive today, you can be treated. You do a pap smear 1 year later, you had not done it last year, not picked up last year, you still have not lost time. The time frame from an exposure to properly becoming cancerous is almost 8 to 10 years. When I say properly cancerous, is when the patient starts getting the symptoms in the form of foul smelling, discharge, intermenstrual
Similar to
bleeding,
AIDS.
postpartum bleeding, all those symptoms. It is almost 8 to 10 years. So that is why the newer studies where WHO initially said that we should be doing the pap smears every year, the latest studies say that the role of pap smear is once in 3 years. There is no need to do pap smears every year.
But it is a
It is
the
a slow
infection directly proportional to the high risk behavior, or is it once in a while
See,
patient?
like I said, 80% of us are prone to develop the infection. Definitely repeated exposure to the infection because of the high risk behavior increases the viral load, increases your chances, increases the number of subtypes that you may be getting exposed to. So increases your chances, but not really.
The old teaching used to be that Kapoor cervix is a disease of women who have multiple sexual partners, etc., etc. Is that still?
Sir, that is what we still say in the textbooks. Well, it is very difficult to say now who has multiple sexual partners and who doesn't. That is the whole thing.
Is it a disease that is related to hygiene, sexual hygiene?
Not really, not documented to be related to sexual hygiene.
Why is it so prevalent in India? Is it not?
No, sir, it is equally prevalent all over the world. The only thing is in our country, still people take it as a taboo. Don't come for their pap smears, don't open up and come down. They would sit on it and not come to the doctor unless and until it becomes really a problem. And when it is diagnosed to be a problem because of this saying that it is because of multiple sexual partners, nobody opens up and says that I have the disease. In fact, this is the major hitch that we are facing when we talk about immunizing a woman. The minute we tell, take the HPV vaccine, the next thing is HPV is sexually transmitted. HPV comes because of multiple partners. I am loyal to my wife is going to be loyal to me. Why should my wife take the vaccine? But we are
Yeah,
still
that's-
finding it coming, whatever loyalty everybody may be saying. Whether the loyalty is not there or whether despite of loyalty it is there, that is a fact.
Very helpful. Thanks.
No, is it if they use safe practices, if they have multiple sexual partners, but if they use condoms or this
Then
barrier
yes, you will
methods,
probably not get HPV, but those who have multiple partners will rarely use it or will have wrong practices also, other ways of spreading the HPV.
okay.
You find HPV everywhere else also.
Now when you say give it by age 9 to 13, I say someone is not sexually active till 21. Do they have to take it at 13 or can they take it
No,
at
the
20?
you can take it anytime, ma'am. The question is, we are trying to catch the population even before the first exposure to the HPV cancer.
Or else I think
So that is why we are trying to say include it as a part of pediatric curriculum, give it off in the pediatric this thing itself, so that even, I mean, like we are saying 21, but
Or whatever. Yeah.
I
15,
think the
16
propaganda
is what we
is
are
a
really
bit
seeing
going in a wrong way. Instead of saying make them aware that it is a sexually they have if the patient
So that how
have
many
to make a
people know
decision
smoking
on
is dangerous,
their
they
self.
smoke.
No, instead of telling that you take a vaccine because you might be getting, instead of that, telling them
I think it's
if you have a high risk behavior, then take it. That would be a much
no,
better
by the time
propaganda.
you have high risk behavior, you are already exposed.
No, yeah, but
Yes, agreed. The vaccine
but
will
it takes
still
up
help
10
you
years.
in
Well-
decreasing, but you are already exposed. And like I said, everybody knows smoking is dangerous. Everybody knows drinking is dangerous, but still everybody does it, right or wrong? How many people do it?
Yeah, but those-
understanding fully, still they are doing it. So this is something which you can't tell a person no.
No, what I'm telling is instead of telling them that take a vaccine to prevent yourself, telling them if you have a high risk behavior, then take the
So
vaccine.
this is what is the argument of the ethical committee saying that when we are giving
Propaganda.
vaccine, we are kind of giving them license to say go do whatever you want. You're not going to die.
No,
of
but
it.
still, the
But-
HIV you can't.
Yes,
there's
but
no
if
vaccine.
we are telling
But
vaccine only
is there
for cancer, we are not telling about
is
anything.
there a method like if after they have a high risk behavior, they take a vaccine and then it is preventable? It's something like that, or
See, that is the next thing that I was going to say, that is there a role of giving the vaccine in those who have already been exposed to the HPV found to be HPV positive?
Yeah.
Earlier it was believed that once you are already proven to be HPV positive, probably not much of a role in taking the vaccine. But now the newer studies are proving that in those women who took the vaccine even after being proven to be HPV positive, the growth of the disease from just being positive to becoming a high-grade lesion, therefore requiring a surgery, that incidence significantly came down by almost 70%. Those who took the vaccine went on to form the full-fledged disease in about 20% of them. Those who took the vaccine did not take the vaccine after being proven to be HPV positive. The disease process went on in about 86% of them. So even after you're positive, there is a role of the vaccine. So it's not that you're already into the wrong practice, so you can't take the vaccine. You still can take the vaccine. But the question is,
May not
we are talking
protect
about
100%.
prevention. We are not talking about treatment. We are talking about prevention. That is what we are trying to achieve. This is something like you are trying to say, anyway, I have treatment for TB, then why take the BCG? I'll treat you when you come back with TB. I'm not
No, but I want to ask you a question now. Late 30s, have any women asked you, can I
Yes,
take
sir.
the vaccine?
In my practice, it's mostly the late 30s because it's the counseling I'm able to do for this vaccine most often is in the postpartum period. When they come back for their postnatal checkups, that is when we are able to talk to them, because typically nobody comes into us pre-pregnancy, nobody comes into us for contraception, nobody comes in for general health checkups regularly, or just married, so I want to get a general health checkup done. The most often we first see a lady is when they are found to be pregnant. So finish off with the pregnancy, they have developed a bonding with you, then when you try to talk to them, it is easier to talk to them. And generally how it is working out for me is I tell them, when you come back for your first postnatal checkup, take your 0 dose after having talked to them. When they come back at 6 weeks for the pediatric first dose, 6 weeks is the time my second dose goes. 6 months for the third dose, my dose goes in at third. So they're finished. So the husband will not say, I have to keep taking my wife to the hospital. You're going with the child, go with the wife, do both.
The literature says up to 45 years you can take the
Yes,
vaccine.
sir, because the data says that your cumulative risk of developing HPV infection is still there till 45. And what it is if by 45 you have not yet turned to be HPV positive, because your cell type starts changing, your transformation zone starts changing. So even if you develop an HPV infection at that stage, chances that you will proceed to go on to forming a cancer is very bleak. It is there. It does not mean to say after 45 you can't take it. So if a woman feels that she is at a high risk at 45, fully justified in taking the vaccine even at 45. We are only trying to cover the major target population now. We are trying to say we have limited resources, let's use it for the high risk population rather than using it for 45, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90. That is what it is. But there is no contraindication. Even at 70 you can go ahead and take the vaccine.
What about men? Why they not doing it in men? You said shown
Fighting
so
it out,
much
sir.
in men.
It's fighting it out, fighting it out.
This is-
Australia has approved use for male child.
In
I think
US
it's-
also.
US
In
also
US
has
also they
approved use for
have
male child.
for boys.
For boys, it's approved.
Not too late for you, Dr. Ben.
I'm touching 50 now.
For boys.
So the vaccine is approved in 127 countries. There are 52 countries for which where it is approved for usage in men also. There are 52 countries. India is not one of them because it has not been found to be a very cost-effective strategy to prevent penile cancer and other cancers. But 52 countries have this approval for men. Australia, US, Canada, and a lot of European countries. These are New Zealand also for that reason, but not so in India.
Yeah.
Finally, yes, it is included in the IAP at least. The IAP has included it as part of vaccines.
I think we are becoming westernized through
Let's hope so, not in everything.
yeah.
In the good things.
Good things, yeah.
Well, this is just the same thing.
So what is it? Is it then it's better to take the quadrivalent, right?
In a sense, yes, it is
Yeah.
going to protect you from the warts also. If you are looking at only cancer protection, both are equally effective. Though
But
yes,
why
there
would
is-
anyone take the bivalent?
Right.
the cost. The
Oh.
quadrivalent is almost 3,000. The bivalent is 1,800 or something. Is I know they are coming down on the rates now.
Your quadrivalent will cost you 2,800.
Bivalent is 2,000.
Yeah, bivalent.
Bivalent is.
But it will give you protection against only 16, 18. But
In
the
a sense, when we are talking about cancer cervix protection, probably both are proving to be equally effective. Again, there is a lot of studies. One of them says our titer levels are better, the other one says our titer levels are better for this after 5 years. Extrapolated data after 10 years, we will need boosters, they will not need boosters. Lot of fight going on between the two companies.
And also from quadrivalent, this is from a company called as MSD, Merck Sharp and Dohme. We have plans to launch a nanovalent vaccine, which will take care of the 9 most common type of the serotypes. In the essence that it will cover 97 to 98% of almost all the HPV infections. The probable date of launch in the US is first quarter in 2016. Maybe in that year itself it will be launched in India. So
Should one wait?
I mean, almost all
No,
the
no, we can take this now and take that then. Let's not wait
there
for
are no
that
specific
exposure to
recommendations as to
happen.
what will happen as to if a woman has already taken quadrivalent, then should she need to take the whole course of nanovalent again? The studies are still going on. In fact, it has got, both the vaccines have got 3 doses. Quadrivalent, they're also doing a study for 2 doses. Some of the clinical trials are going on in Canada and the US, but the results of those are not out as of now. Just, I mean, the nanovalent is, as they call it, next in pipeline. But still, there's maybe another 3 years or so it might. It will
So,
be launched
madam, I
in
was
India.
telling you, let's give a vaccine drive rather than a pap smear screening drive for our employees. It's easier to do that one time.
Yeah.
One time, 3 shots.
Only 3 shots. The pap smear, they'll come once and they'll never come back. They will not come also, or if they come, God knows when they will come.
Sir, one more quick question. Pap smear with positive HPV. After how many months do we need to?
6 months.
Is it 6 months still?
6
They were
months.
thinking of changing it to 1 year.
No, they're still saying 6 months. Do a colposcopy. 6 months later, repeat the pap smear. Again, same findings. Go ahead with your leave or leaves. Persistent HPV, you have to go ahead with leaves. Don't wait more than 6 months. For 6 months, you go ahead and repeat your.
And negative pap smear, 3 years.
Negative pap smear, that's what the data is
For
saying
1 to
now,
3
3 years. Netherlands has come down to 3 years. They are saying 3 years. Most of the studies for pap smears, large number of studies are happening there. They have come, their health checkup schemes are saying once in 3 years is what is pap smear. WHO had said every year, if the woman has done 3 pap smears, all normal, then you can start telling them to come once in 2 years or 3 years. But now WHO is also kind of coming down and saying probably once in 3 years is enough. And from 18, they have increased the age to say 21 onwards if you start screening, that is
Yeah,
enough.
that's what it was.
Earlier they were saying 18 plus everybody needs to screen. Now they are saying 21.
65 stop, right?
65 you stop.
65
You don't
stop.
need to do a pap smear beyond 65. You don't need to do a pap smear in a woman who has undergone hysterectomy for a non-malignant condition. One pap smear done after that. No need to do a pap smear in those women.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Garima, for a wonderful presentation. And I hope we rise above our consciousness and take right. So we don't trust ourselves. Don't trust yourself.
We have this quadrivalent vaccine at RxJX.
Yeah, we have.
Yes.
We have both the vaccines.
Thanks, Dr. Jen. I'm bringing Alicia tomorrow.
Sonal is there. No, that's why I was saying they are willing to come down really on the cost. They give bulk orders.
It's not so bad.
No, but for our employees, it's down to zero.
What to do for the whole staff.
They had told me if there is 20 plus, it will come down 800 on the cost. It's much more better than doing the hospital.
Finally.
I request Dr. Sonal to present with the Rotarix vaccine.
So I was all prepared to do it the Roman way. You know, I talk and you imagine, because things were not working out with the part of my talk. But I'm glad it's there. So what I wanted to do is I talk. When the Merck, I guess they're sponsoring the event. They wanted me to talk about their vaccine and a little bit more. I thought I'd start off with the virus itself. We get a little bit of idea because the slides that come later, I have 2 parts of the presentation. One is what I have kind of a pre-presentation, and then it's about the slides that I have from Merck, which gives a little bit more detailed stuff. And for that, we need to know a little bit more basics. So I thought we'll start off here. So just some interesting facts which I found out when I was trying to do research for this presentation. So the small intestine is usually in an adult presented with about 8 liters of water per day. And by the time the fecal material reaches the anus, it's about just 100 ml of water. So you can see that the efficiency of the small and the large intestine to absorb water is about 99%. Now this is for adults, but it's also believed, it's pretty much very true for pediatric patients. there are some differences which we'll talk about in a little bit. The word diarrhea comes from the Greek word diarrhea, I guess that's how it's said, which means flow through. And I thought it was interesting, it's really literal what the word means and what we use it for. The mechanism for diarrhea usually are either osmotic, and we see that in kids when we have a high osmotic load with kids eating a lot of junk food, sugary foods, a lot of juices. So we see that, we call that toddler's diarrhea. Other is secretory, which is mainly seen in certain kinds of infection like cholera, where whatever stuff is there and you have a lot of secretion from the gut, and that makes it a lot more problematic because you get a lot more dehydration. And the third kind, which is one of the most common kind, is the inflammatory diarrhea, which a lot of our infections are, including the rotavirus infection. Just a little information about what's the prevalence, what's the load of the disease, what's the mortality, what's the morbidity. And it was eye-popping when I read that 1 in 6 deaths among children under 5 years of age in India is because of diarrheal diseases, now not necessarily rotavirus. So the studies that I found in 2005, when they had kind of a big study, 334,000 deaths were from diarrhea, and out of which 34% were related to rotavirus. So rotavirus is a major mortality reason for kids in India. The prevalence of, now these two facts are from the WHO bulletin that was published in last July. The prevalence of rotavirus among diarrheal diseases, if you break down according to ages, and this is a different paper, I'll let you know, it's 13% in less than 7 months of age, 31% in 7 to 12 months of age. Well, the last part is gone. It's about around 20% in up till 20-25% up till 2 years of age. The other interesting statistics is the for mortality. 50% of the mortality of rotavirus infection is within the first year of life, and 75% within the first 2 years of life. So that's why it's really important for us to get the vaccine for the kids, because what we see, the major damage is done by 2 years of life. Boys are twice as likely to get admitted for infection, which we kind of generally see in a lot of things where boys do get much sicker. But the irony is, in India, in spite of boys being more likely to be admitted, that means they have more severe disease, the ratio of mortality for rotavirus between girls and boys is 1.3 to 1.7. So we can see the difference between the healthcare boy versus a girl gets.
This 1 year, we last when I attended, they still told us it was 6 months. Within 6 months, the vaccine has to be given, or
yes,
above 6 months,
yes.
it doesn't
So
matter.
This is just the mortality. We'll talk about the vaccine and the reason why it's supposed to be given before that time. This is just the mortality that we have in India with kids not getting the rotavirus, because the reality is majority of the kids are not getting the rotavirus vaccine. The rotavirus vaccine is not incorporated in the national immunization scheme as yet. The difference that I said between kids and adults is, and the reason why we have more mortality in kids is because they do have more insensible losses compared to adults, because of the surface area is greater, and the chances of fever is much higher, and the kidneys are immature and the compensatory mechanism is not that great, and we all know how difficult it is to hydrate a kid when the kid is not feeling well. The inflammatory diarrhea, what it does, it's not just fluid. There's mucus, protein, and blood loss, and that all adds to the dehydration and the morbidity. So this is again, I got this from the WHO bulletin, kind of how the incidence of rotavirus is in different parts of India, and as you can see, the northern belt, the most populous belt of India, has one of the highest amount of rotavirus prevalence. And Karnataka is low, but really not that low. We still see quite a lot of rotavirus, and it was interesting for me to see that the northeastern state also have quite a lot. So it's kind of spread out pretty much everywhere. And this bar slide, just to kind of say it again, is you see the mortality with rotavirus, which is pretty high, the highest between 3 to 11 months of age. And so we want to get them before 3 months of age, so we start immunizing them so we can decrease that. Well, this did not show up. The reason I wanted to show a picture is because we're going to be talking a lot about the serotypes and the proteins and all. So basically, rotavirus has about 6 structural proteins, which are VP1 to VP7. Well, that's not 6, and there are about 6 non-structural proteins. And out of that, yeah, the outer capsid is 6 structural proteins and 6 non-structural. And out of the structural protein, we kind of zoom in more on the VP4 and the VP7. These are the glycoproteins, and these are the ones that will elicit neutralizing antibodies. The others will not. And you will, the reason I'm telling you this is we are going to be referring to this more when we come to the other slides. The serotypes G1, G2, G3, G4, and G9 are based on the VP7 glycoprotein. This was an interesting statement in the WHO bulletin that if the rotavirus vaccine is delivered as part of the national program in India, about 4% of all death among children less than 5 years can be prevented. So far, we have not reached the rotavirus is not a part of the national immunization program. Going to give you a brief recap of the rotavirus vaccines. I've actually have mentioned their trade names here because we all deal with that on a day-to-day basis. So back in 1998, we had the RotaShield virus that came up, and I was in residency, and we were all excited about it because you would have a lot of kids with Rota in the hospital, and to treat them, it's not that easy. So we started with the vaccination, but very soon, and I think within about 6 to 9 months, the vaccine was taken back because there was a 22-fold increase in the cases of intussusception. The reason being, rotavirus is taken orally, so it's absorbed by your Peyer's patches that are in the intestine, and when they swell up, they can act as the site for which the intussusception can begin. So working on that, this was back in 1998, and then RotaTech, which is the pentavalent vaccine, was introduced in 2006 after a lot of studies. FDA took a while to approve it. And the pentavalent vaccine here, it contains the G1, G2, G3 or G4 of the VP7 of the human strain and VP4 of the bovine strain. And there's a reassortment. So it's quite fancy, but it's covering about quite a lot of area there. And this is a schedule of 3 doses. Another vaccine came into the scene in 2010 by the FDA, and I understand it was introduced earlier in India. It's a monovalent human vaccine, and it's based on the G1P8, and it's a schedule of 2 doses. The rationale here is that in spite of being a monovalent vaccine, because it's human, it's supposed to work well, and of course there is it helps you, it kind of covers the rest of the serotype. And this is the newest entrant, is RotaVac. It's in news right now. This is a local Indian manufactured vaccine. They worked with the NIH, with the Indian Institute of, I guess, infectious diseases, with the Melinda and Bill Gates, and they've come up with this vaccine. It's still to be launched. And it's again a monovalent vaccine. It's supposed to work really well. It has a schedule of 3 doses. Would like to point out now, most the Rotarex, the Rotatec are relatively expensive vaccines.